Well, welcome to this episode of Sono, Calabrese, a program of conversations with people in our community. The previous guests have all been Calabrese, but tonight's guest, Ciro de Girolamo, is not, although he works in an area of importance to all prospective students in Australia. He's an education agent counsellor, currently with MET Australia Education Agency, and he gives advice about educational opportunities to overseas students. We're very grateful to have Ciro join us tonight and share his experiences in what might be considered a very, very specialised field. Welcome, Ciro, and thanks for giving us time and joining us in our conversation.
Buonasera, Vincent. My pleasure to be here tonight.
Yeah. Firstly, can you explain to us what an education agent counsellor does?
Sure, absolutely. So education agent counselors mainly focuses on international student visas. My agency focuses mainly on Italians and Latin American students because that's where we specialize in those areas. And virtually what we do is we find the right course for people based on their necessities and actually their expectations for their future careers.
And does that differ from the work that, for example, a migration agent does?
It definitely is, yes, absolutely. So we only focuses on, let's say, students. For example, we recommend the right career, and then we can look after them with student visas applications only. So we don't provide any immigration advice, and we don't give any suggestions for permanent residency.
So do you work in conjunction with a migration agent?
Absolutely, because these two things can actually go together as well. So we are very respectful of our roles. For example, if a student would like to know if a course will lead them to permanent residency, what we virtually do, we organize a meeting, usually free of charge, with our associated migration agent.
Thank you. And why do students come to Australia to study?
Well, Australia, and I'm from, I live in Melbourne, and specifically here. The level of education is really, really good, and appeals a lot of students from overseas because obviously, for example, in some countries, they don't have opportunities to work while they're studying. Instead, here they can actually have a full experience between studying maybe English initially and then a vocational course or a higher education course, together with some work experience that can improve on communication skills and all of that. So it's very important.
And are these postgraduate students, or can they actually come and do their prior secondary education here as well?
Yeah, no, very good question, Vincent. They can virtually do anything they are aiming to achieve. For example, they can start from English courses, or they can actually do some vocational courses or complete even in year 12, as long as they are genuine students. So that's the main requirement from the government.
But for example, let's take a law student, a law graduate in Italy.
Yes.
Would there be any benefit to him coming to Melbourne to do a Master of Laws? And
Absolutely. Obviously, for example, a bachelor degree in law in Italy compared to a degree in law in Australia would definitely be different because the requirements and the laws are different. But studying a master in Australia can actually open a lot of possibilities for them worldwide, because a study in English, and especially for example, a bachelor degree, can easily be recognized here with maybe a graduate certificate that complement what they studied overseas, and they can practice in Australia as well as overseas, for example, in Italy or where they studied.
I note that you're fluent in a number of languages. Is that a necessary quality for an education counsellor, or are you just one of those people that picks up languages very easily?
Oh, you're very kind, Vincent. You're very kind. Look, I'm definitely helps. I have to say, because especially with Latin American students. Yeah, yeah. And for example, we have different areas. Let's say I speak fluently Spanish. I hope Italian and a bit of English. But Met Australia, it's actually focusing on different areas. For example, I've been helping Latin American students, but we are expanding the business now. So we got a dedicated person for Latin America who is fluent in Spanish and can actually provide accurate information in the students' own language. We also have on board Dominic Zaya, which actually specializes with students from the rest of the world where they speak good English. He's from Australia, and he's actually the person that does all the reviews on the GTEs and makes sure that the requirements are met. And now I can focus only on to Italian people. So it's
and that's what I was going to ask you. In terms of numbers, are there large numbers from Italy that want to come and study in Australia?
Yes, definitely, actually. For example, Italians have a different sort of an approach compared to Latin American people. But for example, the 80% of the cases, they're already in Australia because they come on a different visa, and they decide, to looking at the schools and the quality of education and the career pathway they can obtain, they decide actually to undertake some studies. So in percentage, after a year in Australia, almost the 80–90% of Italians decide to stay and study here.
Right. And can you give us an idea of overall numbers in terms of how many would there be?
It's obviously because of COVID, the situation has dropped sensibly, but the numbers are pretty high. An exact number, I'm actually not quite sure, but we have been helping a lot of Italian people.
And I'm intrigued that you say a lot of Latin American students would want to come into Australia. Why would they choose Australia instead of the United States or Canada?
Yes, that's a very good question as well. So, for example, as I was explaining initially, in Australia, the Australian government gives the opportunity to actually work. And for example, in the United States, I don't think these opportunities actually there. So, and plus Australia can enjoy a very high quality of education, and with their masters or their career opportunities overseas, they can highlight their work, job outcomes and employments, and achieve a better salary compared to different areas. And I also believe that obviously this is a migration agent field, but they can have good pathways as well with their studies here.
Yeah. All right. Before we get into the detail of studying in Australia, I just want to ask you a little bit about your own background, because like most people in Australia, you're an immigrant yourself.
Exactly, yes.
And I think you said you were born in Milan, but
Correct.
your family moved to Genoa when you were a child.
Correct.
Yeah? And so your education, you undertook that in Genoa?
I have actually performed my, I graduated in optic, that's my initial background, and I studied in Savona, which is a little town close to Genova, about 30 kilometers away. And then I moved back to Milan to actually do my university studies, and I graduated in optometry as well.
But did you move to Milan with your family or merely by yourself for your studies?
Yeah, well, I was pretty lucky because back in the 60s, my non is from Napoli and from Puglia, from my both of my family sides. They migrated to Milan. So
you're a southerner.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. With such a name, it's impossible not to be. So my dad's family is originally from Napoli, and instead my mom's family is from Puglia region. So it's they both migrated to Milan, and only my dad, when I was 12, 13 years old, decided to move to Genova. So when I went back to Milan, was a bit easier for me because I still had my nonnies there and my uncles.
Right. So your nonni continued to live in Milan, although your father moved to Genoa.
Correct. Yes.
And do
Yes.
you remember why or did he discuss with you why he moved back to Genoa?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. For example, my dad decided to move back to along the beach, let's say,
Yeah.
because he couldn't cope anymore with the fog and the
The
cold
terrible
weather.
climate in Milan,
That's
especially in
correct.
winter.
That's correct. That's correct. So I was pretty lucky he made that move because, in Genova, I met all of my best friends and I started my career in optic, which, actually was a big beneficial help. It was a big benefit for me when I came to Australia.
And as you said, you studied optometry and worked as an optometrist in Italy for
Correct.
quite a while, did you not?
Yes. That's right. That's right.
And then you came to Australia.
Correct.
What was it? When was that? Around about 2016?
Yeah,
Or?
absolutely. I graduated was back in 2011, and before that I was working for my uncles because they do have 3 optometry stores in Milan. So my father has got 2 brothers and they both in business together. So I was working in one of the 3 stores. And then before I came to Australia, I came to Australia in 2013. Before that, I've actually been to Ireland for a year, and I was a babysitter there, an au pair. And my goal was to learn English and then come to Australia with a bit of knowledge of the language so I could actually work in my field.
Yeah. So you intended to work as an optometrist in Australia?
Correct.
Were your qualifications recognised in Australia?
No, I didn't. I was lucky enough that I held 2 qualifications. So one was an optician, a qualification as an optician, and the other qualification was as an optometrist. So I could work as an optician because it was at a lower level and no registration was required in Victoria.
But in terms of your formal qualification as an optometrist, that wasn't recognised in Australia.
Unfortunately not.
Yeah, and so you said had you come to Australia intending to further your studies in optometry or simply to try and find employment?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. For example, initially, I really wanted to be an optometrist in Australia. But as the time went, I realized that optometry in Italy is completely different to optometry in Australia. For example, if you are an optometrist in Italy, you can focus on the whole side of the shop. So retails, edging lenses, fitting frames, repairs and everything. Instead, in Australia, an optometrist virtually limits, it's a bit more specific, so they only do eye tests. So, and I enjoy to be in contact with people and to talk to them. So I was actually happy to be an optician.
Yeah. And so you chose Australia. What motivated you to choose to come to Australia other than finding employment as
different areas? Yeah. Look, Australia to me has always been a dream for some reason that I cannot even explain. I knew that there would have been a big Italian community in Australia as well. So, for example, in a way, for Italians, it's a bit easier to come because we can access to different visas that will give us some work permissions and time to adapt to the society. And I was lucky enough after a few months to meet an Italian optometrist in Munipons that was pretty happy with me, and we actually ended up very good friends. So he decided to sponsor me, and I could stay here.
And at some stage, you decided to make a career change, and you went into educational counselling. What prompted you to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, obviously, because of my background as an optometrist, I really love helping people, and I found that in this section, in this profession, as an educational counselor, there is a lot to do. So we can really do a lot for people that are here in Australia, become a reference for them, and a person that they can always refer to for any sort of problems or suggestions, or when you are so far away from home, in my opinion, it's very important to find somebody that you can rely on.
All right, and you're formally qualified as an educational counsellor, and so now we can move into the nitty-gritty, as it were. In order for a student, and let's say it's a student from Italy, to enter Australia on a study visa,
Yes.
what's the process that he has to go through?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, as I was explaining initially, Vincent, the first main requirement is that the student will be a genuine student. So that's the first thing that we look at as an agency. So in order to be a genuine student, it means that they need to be prepared to come and study in Australia, comply with the visa conditions on a student visa, which are 40 hours fortnightly allowed to work. Then for example, they need to have a clear career, a career goal wherever they would like to get. And for example, for Italians, it's a little easier because we are in ranking #1 as a passport preference from the Australian government. So we don't have to comply with we need to comply with all the requirements, but at the time of this application, the government might not ask for some requirements, such as financial capacity or English language test to be provided to prove that they are proficient in English.
And in terms of the institution which a student may choose, do you assist a student in choosing an appropriate institution, or when they come to you, they say, I want to go to Melbourne University, or I want to go to Monash University?
Absolutely, absolutely. For example, we assist students to actually find the best educational provider that suits their needs. And what we'll do is we provide them with options that they can choose from based on let's say the units of the course, and maybe based on the facility, the position, and also based on all the students' feedbacks. For example, it's very important for us to put the students in touch with the education provider before they commit to their studies, because that way they can actually get a bit of an experience before paying the fees and all of that.
Well, that's what I wanted to explore. I would imagine that the institution or the educational provider, as you refer them to them, would have information available on the internet that people from Italy and other countries could access in their home countries. Do you provide more information for any student that makes inquiries, and if so, what sort of information do you think is important for them to know?
Definitely. No, that's not a very good question. So some students, especially maybe not those who don't have a very good level of English, it's a bit difficult for them to find information in their own language and pick the right college before they come from overseas. So our job virtually is to translate this information in the students' own language and to provide them with the most accurate, let's say, information about the college, so that they can choose in complete confidence where they would like to study, the programs that the school offers, and what we also happy to do, and in the 90% of the cases we'll do as well, it is, well, if they are from overseas, is a video call with the educational provider, which are happy to introduce them to the teachers, explain in details also the courses, and we are there for them to actually translate and interpret the information.
Right, and I'd imagine that financial considerations would play a part as to which institution might be chosen by any particular student. Have you
That's,
found that
yep,
to be the case?
that's correct. That's correct. For
And
example,
is there much difference between the cost of studying at various institutions?
there is absolutely, yes, yes. For example, there are many prices offered by providers, but what we are focusing on is to guide the students to good providers that offer a very high level of education at a reasonable cost. So the student can achieve the results without spending a fortune, but obviously the final decision, it always belongs to the students.
Yeah, clearly. And you mentioned earlier that some of them have imperfect English. Now that raises a question in my mind. How can they cope with the educational system here if their English is inadequate?
Absolutely. So before they enroll, let's say if a student would like to come from Italy and study to become a chef, yeah. So what they need to do in order to enroll into a cookery course is to pass some English test. And if they don't have that that level that is required for them to enroll into the course, what we organize for them is a period of studies previous, to the vocational course that prepares them to do that. For example, there are private educational providers that prepare students from, let's say, beginner level to the upper intermediate level, which is the minimum level in order to enroll into a vocational course. And they will do, let's say, that process based on their capacities. And once they have achieved the level they would like to, let's say, allows them to enroll into the vocational course, then they can actually enroll.
And they do the English course in Australia, or do they do it in their home country?
Yeah, absolutely. They can actually come to Australia and study English here. And also that's a beautiful opportunity for them to mix with the society, communicate to the people, and get used to the slang and the way we speak.
And is that the same visa as the ordinary student visa, the subclass 500, I think, is the student visa?
Absolutely. Yes, that's exactly right. For example, a student can come from overseas and study only English. Not necessarily they need to study a vocational course or a higher education course. They can just come to improve on their English. And then after they completed their studies, they're obviously, they will have to return back to their own country unless their intentions have changed.
And how long, let's say a student obtains a visa to come and study English as a precursor to studying some other area, how long does a visa last? Is there a time limit to the visa?
Although there is no time limit on student visas, there is a time that we suggest not to go over that, because obviously if a student visa will last for about 10 years, the genuine component of the visa of the student is actually compromised, in my opinion. So the student visa will last for as long as they are enrolled in their course of studies. They can do a package course between English and vocational, or English and a university degree or master. And the visa length is actually a consequence of how long they're going to study for.
So I was going to say, let's say I'm in Italy, I decide to come and study in Australia, I apply for a visa and I say, well, first of all, I want to do an English course because my English is not good.
Yes.
Because I want to be thorough, I might only do 2 subjects a year, and that might take me, 4 or 5 years to complete the course?
Yeah, so for international students, it's very important to actually keep a progress of their results, because their main purpose is just to study. For example, the government is allowing the students to work, but their main purpose is actually to comply with their study requirements. So, which means attendance, they will have to go to school full time, and they must perform. So they must show the government they are progressing in their studies, in order to be genuine. Yeah.
But my point was, assuming I passed each subject, is there a requirement that, for example, I need to pass 4 subjects a year or 2 subjects a year, or is 1 a year sufficient?
We're talking about English classes, yeah? Yeah, perfect. So usually what the educational providers say is that usually it takes about 3 months for a student to go from one level to the next. So it could take a little bit longer and could take a little bit less as well, but their programs usually to step up in the level is about 3 months time. So for example, if a student delays, you know, the next step is not a big issue because for example, they are studying English and they will have, let's say, 1 year to, or whatever they would like to study to comply with that requirement. And if they won't be able to do so, they can decide to extend for another student visas and apply for another English course to achieve the level they would actually like to.
And you mentioned before vocational education. Is that area the one that attracts the greatest number of international students?
Definitely, yes. Yes, definitely Europeans and specifically Italians. Also Latin American people are very attracted to vocational courses because a vocational course in Australia prepares you really well, especially if you go to, let's say, a TAFE education. You know, they got very good equipments, and the student can actually get a very big benefit on the work experience and preparation on how to do the job on the place.
So it's possible, again, for an Italian student to decide to come to Australia, for example, and study plumbing.
Yes, absolutely.
And I take it that applies to any other trade, or?
Exactly. For example, we have a lot of painting and decorating courses available, and that's a field that Italians are very attracted because, for example, in Italy such a course doesn't really exist, so they can qualify and get specialized in Australia, so that when they go back to Italy or they would like to work overseas, they are qualified and not just hold the work experience.
And the Australian qualification would be recognised in Italy, would it?
It depends. It depends, obviously. For example, as we were saying before about the bachelor degree in law, there might be courses where you need to get accredited, but most of trading courses are recognized in Italy as well. Yes. For example, painting, solid plastering, wall and floor tiling. In Italy, there's no such a qualification. If you hold a qualification, it definitely increases your job opportunities at a higher level salary.
Yeah. And just for that, and is it the case that in terms of what might be called the academic pursuits, there are more postgraduate students rather than undergraduate students coming to study in Australia?
Yes. Usually, I talk about my agency. The 90% of the students that try to reach out on us, they already hold at least a year 12 certificate, and they would like to specialize in Australia, or let's say some of them, they all hold a bachelor degree and they would like to study a master degree or sometimes even a PhD in some cases.
Now, I understand that most education providers require international students to enter into a formal agreement. Is that your experience?
Yes, definitely. So every student will have to actually express their interest into enrolling in an education provider college, and the education provider will have to accept the students. And once this is all happened, then the student will have to pay their fees, the tuition fees, enrollment fees, and after that they will have to sign. At the same time they pay, they will have to sign an offer letter, which virtually is a contract that bonds the student to the provider.
Well, let's say it's me again, and I don't speak English very well. What assistance can I receive before I actually sign up to the agreement with the education provider?
Absolutely. So the students can do that independently, or they can do it through an agency. So the benefit to go through an agency is that an agent can actually speak and explain in their own language what the contract and what it's all about, this agreement between the school and the student. Indeed, we do have to comply with these requirement. We have to explain in detail refund policies and enrollment policies. So everything that the student will have to comply with has to be explained by the agency. And as I was saying, that's a benefit for students that come from overseas to refer to an agency, an Italian agency could be, or Latin American agency, or the country where they come from. So we can explain in details what's all about.
I take it you've seen these agreements between educational institutions and students.
Yes.
Are they very long?
Yeah.
In terms of pages, or?
Yeah, absolutely. It varies based on the provider and based on the course they are enrolling. For example, the easiest agreement to read are the ones that, for students that would like to study English language. But the most difficult ones are for, let's say, diplomas or advanced diplomas in terms of vocational courses, and definitely bachelor degrees and master degrees and PhD.
And these agreements, I take it, would have provisions there as to how much the student has to pay?
Yeah, absolutely. In an offer letter, virtually there will be also the payment plan, which explains exactly all the fees, when they're due, and if the student thinks, that those arrangements are not suitable for them, they can always review it before a final offer letter has been released.
But once they sign, they're bound, aren't they? They can't.
Yes and no, because actually there is an agreement in place, but students obviously are always free to decide whatever they would like to do. For example, there is an agreement between the provider and the student, but it doesn't mean that the student is tied with them for the whole time. For example, they might realize that the school is not providing the service that they initially promised, or they don't feel as comfortable as they thought. So if they have done the visa or their application to the provider with an agency, it's the agency's job to actually support the student and communicate between the student and the provider.
Now, as I understand it, up until recently, the educational provider could not ask for more than 50% of the fee up front, could it?
That's right. So, for example, that's a government requirement, and that's very important to have it clear. So if the student would like to pay the 100% of tuition fees and enrollment fees and material fees, is completely up to the student, but the provider cannot ask for the 100% of fees up front.
But as I was saying, the law has now been changed to enable a student to choose to pay whatever amount he wants up front. Now, give us a dollar figure as to the cost of some of these courses, if you can.
Sure, absolutely. For example, if we are considering to study English, obviously many educational providers have reviewed their fees based on the financial situation that has been affected the world, with the COVID-19. So now you can find courses that used to be about $400 per week at about $160 or $180 a week. So the value for money is really, really good at the moment. And the minimum deposit that usually a school requires is about $1,000.
So how long do you think that these, what you refer to as reasonable fees, will continue in place? Presumably once the demand increases, so will the cost. Is that?
It's true, but in my opinion, there is a lot to catch up on after the pandemic will leave us. So I really hope actually that this promotion will will stay in place for a while, because as I was mentioning initially, our goal is actually to help students, and obviously financially is a big support that we can provide to them.
And that's $180 a week. What about accommodation, living expenses, travelling? The students must have independent means to pay for those, or is there any other assistance that they can receive?
They can decide if either they would like to undertake this financial requirement independently, so which means that they need to show obviously financial capacity to the government if required by their visa and by the government at the time of a visa application, or they can actually access to let's say some savings from the family, or some ongoing financial support from the family, or from a family business, or either from external association that provides some loans as well for students.
But there's no assistance, no financial assistance that they can access in Australia?
There are some associations that can provide some loans for international students. Yes. Obviously, then the student will have to pay, unfortunately, some interest, but they can access that as well in case they need to.
And am I right that there are different rules for students who are under 18 years of age?
Definitely, yes. We personally don't specialize in that area because it's quite complex, and we at the moment we don't receive as many requests from overseas to actually do this type of assistance, but there is definitely some different requirements, so pastoral care and all of that, absolutely.
And I think also there's got to be guarantees of accommodation and everything else for students underage.
Absolutely, yes.
And I also understand that students are entitled to some or have certain rights before they enrol, in terms of explanation as to the course they're doing, the fees. And is that primarily your job if he engages you as an agent, or is there some other body or entity that provides a student with that information?
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, if they approach us as an agency, we do need to comply and help the students with that requirements and checklist. If they will do that independently, obviously the responsibility is completely on the student and the provider to organize that. Yes.
And yeah, the students ask many questions, either about the agreement that they've got to sign or what their rights may be before they sign up, or do they just sign on the line because they're so keen to come to Australia?
Look, the students are actually very, very keen, but it's our job to explain all of those requirements, even though they don't ask for it, because we got a very good ethic, and we like to respect that. So we would like to provide the best service and the most information that we can to students before actually they sign anything, so they are completely aware, and they will be able to decide on whatever suits them the best, obviously. Yes.
And let's suppose that the student has signed up, is paid 50% of the course fee, and 3 weeks into the course, he says, look, I'm not learning anything at this institution. Can he, as it were, get out of the contract?
Yes, absolutely. So what usually happens here is it's completely at the school discretion, and obviously the student has to provide a very valid reason before they comply with the first 6 months. Before they finish the first 6 months of course, the school can decide whether the student will get a release letter or not. If the student is not happy with the outcome, they can always do an internal appeal to the educational provider. And if that is not successful and the student is not happy with the outcome, they can actually refer to the ombudsman as well.
In your experience, are there many students who express dissatisfaction with the course that they've agreed to do?
I think it's all in the matter of the preparation. So let's say the more you explain the student, the more in detail you go in the course, the more prepared they are and they know exactly what they are choosing. So we really invest a lot of time into explaining and making them feeling the school before they enroll, because we want to try to avoid this. So in our specific case, it has never happened that a student decided to change the school beforehand or before the 6 months anyway, because they were very happy with the consultation and the outcome.
Well, that's your expertise, but do you know of cases where students have in fact tried to get out of the contract?
There are many, yes, and in my opinion, it's a very tricky situation, because obviously at this stage agents are not yet regulated, so the responsibility just falls on the schools and on the students. So what happens is, if a student, let's say, said, oh, I made a bad decision, I want to change, and they go to the appealing department within the school, and the school doesn't approve it, then obviously it's a major situation where the ombudsman has to sort it out, and obviously a good reason has to be provided to the Department of Home Affairs.
And there may be serious repercussions for the student, may there not? Because if he ceases to study, isn't that a breach of a condition of his visa?
That's correct. For example, a student is allowed to change their course at any time, obviously, yeah, because as we were saying initially, they are not, they can't be obligated to do something they don't want to do, but at the same time, there is always the department in between. So if they change their courses for an equivalent certificate or higher qualification, they can actually change it within an internal program from the government and the educational providers called PRISMs. And once it's all sorted out in PRISM, the government is aware and they can enroll into the other course. Otherwise, if they decide to, let's say, go back to a previous level and not comply with the progression, they will have to apply for, they must apply for a new student visa.
Yeah. And is it still a requirement that the educational provider has to agree to a transfer or a change of institution?
Absolutely, absolutely. This program called PRISM that I was mentioning, it's actually a program where the educational provider registers the students to the Department of Home Affairs, so to the Department of Immigration. For example, if the provider doesn't provide the student with a release letter, virtually the student cannot go anywhere else because they bond to that. And
do you know of cases where that has happened?
Personally, I am not aware of it, but obviously there are policies and procedures to follow in case it happens.
And the only redress that the student would then have, as you've told us, I think, is a final appeal to the Ombudsman.
Yes.
But if the Ombudsman says, I find against you, student, then the student has two choices, does he not? He either continues with the same institution or leaves Australia.
Exactly. Unfortunately, that's the case. But in my opinion, if a student will have to report to the Ombudsman, a major situation is definitely there, and the student will have enough reason to provide and obtain a release letter, because educational providers are actually very flexible, and they understand the student's situation, and they understand how difficult it could be for them, especially if they are a bit younger, to pick a course, for the future. So the intention of a student can change.
Yeah, and you don't see it as a major problem, the hurdles to changing institutions.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. I always like to invest maybe a few more hours with the student before they enroll and avoid this type of situation, rather than actually suggesting, oh yeah, enroll for this course and then you can change it in case you don't like it, because it's very important that they maintain their genuine intention to actually come and study to that course.
What if the unthinkable happens and a student pays all his money up front and the educational provider then becomes financially unstable or even goes bankrupt?
Mhm.
Does the student have any redress in that situation?
Absolutely. So it's all stated in the offer letter, and the offer letter says that if a student hasn't actually started the course yet, they are entitled on the 100% refund on tuition fees. I know about bankruptcy and all of this, but obviously there will be an association that will look after the debts of the company, in this case the educational provider, and the 100% refund will be done on tuition, usually not on enrollment fees, which is about 150 to, let's say, $300 based on the educational provider.
And am I right? I think the government runs a program called the Tuition Protection Service, which in effect guarantees that if the educational provider goes bankrupt or is unable to provide the course, and is unable to refund the money, then the Tuition Protection Service refunds the money to the student.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's exactly right. So they will get all of the tuition fees back, and it's a sort of a guarantor for the students, so they feel a bit more comfortable to enroll and to to pay, obviously from overseas, some amount of money that.
And well, yes, all right. That raises another question, which you may have experience about, and that is, let's say that an unfortunate student gets into conflict with the education provider. What access does he have to legal services or legal advice? Does he have to fund that himself, or is there any way that that he can get it without charge?
Oh, no, absolutely. So, for example, if there are good reasons and the student is unhappy at the school, or let's say the expertise were not matched, the student will be able to leave the provider, getting a full refund. Obviously, if he has already used up some tuition fees, they will be calculated and deducted, but then it's in the provider compulsory role to refund the student of tuition that they haven't been used.
Yeah, and as I understand it, there are support services that the education provider is obliged to provide to the student, are there not? And
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
these are support and welfare services, and as I understand it, even legal services if required.
That's exactly right. And also, the schools should have as well a student support officer within the college, so that they can provide some counseling in case they need to, and obviously they need to have in place some policies, having a lawyer that can help them in case it's needed as well. But we also offer that service as an independent agency to students.
Right. And also the educational provider is supposed to provide emergency health services. Is that?
Emergency health services? I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure about that.
Because I was going to ask, as I understand that it's also a condition of the visa that the student has to maintain overseas health cover.
Yes, yeah, I understand your question now.
Or medical insurance that we've got here in Australia.
That's right. Yes, yes. Sorry, I understand the question. Yeah. So virtually, the student can purchase their they can purchase their health insurance through the provider or independently, but they must do so before they apply for their visa. So they will need to be covered, obviously, if they need to go to a hospital or to a GP, they need to have their private health insurance before they actually apply for the visa, for the student visa application.
All right, and so that I guess it's not just to protect the student, but also to make sure that our health system doesn't suffer financially as a consequence of a number of students falling ill when they're in Australia and being able to access the health system without a fee.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. And in my case as well, I can just have a little parenthesis, to talk about what happened to me. For example, when I was a temporary resident, I was on a working visa, and I had to have my private health insurance, but in my wage, I was still paying for the Medicare levy. And at the end of the financial year, if you haven't applied for Medicare, you can actually apply for a deduction on taxes for that. So
that's good. Yeah. Now, another one of the conditions that I understand are imposed on the visa is that students have to notify any change of address.
That's compulsory, yes.
Yeah.
Within 7 days, they will have to apply the change of addresses to the education provider and Department of Home Affairs. Absolutely.
Do you know what's the rationale for that? Why did we not trust students? Or
I think it's because, when you are a temporary resident, the government has to monitor your actions, and they will have to know if there are any communications to be sent. Sometimes we're all very technology advanced, but sometimes receiving a official letter into your mailbox, it's probably more appropriate, especially if it's official.
Yeah. And I just want to ask now about the concept of maintaining a suitable standard or progress. Does that simply mean that the student has to show that he's progressing through the course in a reasonable manner, albeit not in the shortest possible time, or are there time limits that have to be complied with?
This usually applies to the provider. So the provider guarantees that the student will maintain a progress. And for example, usually there are in vocational courses, for example, the provider allows 3 attempts in terms of assessments. So if the student fails the whole 3 attempts, then there will be a problem, and the student will have to provide a reason why they were not able to actually comply with the assessment and get a satisfactory result.
And I know that, every educational provider will have in his agreement that integrity is important, and that cheating and plagiarism are frowned on. But I would imagine that must be a common occurrence, especially for somebody whose language skills are not that good. What's your experience?
For example, the job of an agent is also to choose a provider that can actually support the student in the best possible way. So, for example, we do have also agreements with colleges, and we personally do not sign contracts if we know that the college would not be able to provide the service that they promise, and can guarantee, let's say, the students support that they actually require. For example, if a student struggles with their English language and they are enrolled in a vocational course, the provider will notify the student to actually enroll in an English course, and the student will have to provide, a reason, why they cannot speak English, and they need to do that to the Department of Home Affairs, so to the immigration border.
And next area I want to canvass with you is this: that one of the reasons that you gave earlier about the motivation of students coming to Australia is that here we permit students to work 40 hours a fortnight. Again, I assume that, the law applies to everybody equally. So a student from Italy who works in a restaurant should be receiving the same wage as an Australian-born person who works in the same restaurant.
That's exactly right. Yes.
But
So it's actually stated into their visa condition that they can check with the Fair Work Association about wages in Australia, and they need to be treated exactly the same as a local.
yeah, but anecdotal evidence tells us that in fact they're often victimised in their employment, either in the sense that, to use a phrase, they're kept off the books, and that means that they don't exist in the records of the employer, and therefore they don't have any entitlement to any of the protections under the legislation. For example, if someone is injured at work, they're entitled to compensation, etc. In your experience, does that happen often?
Look, it definitely happens in some sections that I'm aware of, but obviously I don't know any specific cases. But I know that unfortunately this is a common condition that shouldn't happen. But some businesses can take advantages, unfortunately, about international or temporary residents that are, desperate.
Do the educational providers explain to the students that although in theory international students in Australia are protected to the same degree as national students, the reality is that most students are not even part-time workers, they're casual workers, which legally means that they don't get any of the protections that even part-time workers get. Would you agree with that?
I do, unfortunately, yes. In some cases, let's say the students don't get the benefit of sick leave, annual leave, and all of these benefits. And it's a shame that all of us should really work towards a better outcome for the future. But
well, I say that because this is going back about 3 years ago. I was actually at the consul, the Italian consulate in St Kilda Road, and these two young men walk in, one in a bandage all over his hand, and I couldn't help but overhear saying that he'd been injured at work, and his friend there also worked there and was a witness to it. But his problem was that the employer said, "Yeah, you're not my employee." And the question the consular official asked him, well, show me your pay slip. And he said, well, he didn't give me a pay slip because he paid me cash, because he told me he could pay me more if he paid me cash rather than if he had to pay me. And the concern for that person was that he couldn't access the benefits under the workers' compensation legislation, and yet it was a clear-cut case of an accident that happened at work, and if it had happened to an Australian worker, he would have been automatically covered.
Yes.
That's yeah. And as you would have heard, not just, but a lot of employers have now been pursued by the Fair Work Commission for underpaying people whilst they're employing them. And the final matter I want to get to is what happens to the international student when there's a pandemic like we are in at the moment. And although he theoretically can work 40 hours a fortnight, there's simply no work there. How does he survive?
Absolutely, that's a very good question. And for example, there has been in Victoria especially an association that is part of the Australian government. It's called Study Melbourne, that they offered financial support, a one-off payment to students who were struggling, and they had experience of financial hardship. So they could apply for financial support. And also some help to get a rental reduction. The problem of that was that many students, unfortunately, as you were stating, Vincent, they're not regulated with a contract, or they were maybe working for some employers under different conditions, and the only proof that they could provide was their bank statement and a drop of financial. But also that was a bit of an issue because a student will have to comply with their financial capacity before they apply for a student visa. So for example, international students, before they do their visa, they will have to guarantee the government that they have enough funds to pay for their tuition. They will have enough funds to pay for the living cost arrangements in Australia. So it's a bit of a tricky situation. I personally thought, that nobody was prepared for this pandemic, and it just happened. And actually, the situation was managed in the best possible way from government authorities, and even the Red Cross of Australia tried to support students who were not eligible for study Melbourne financial benefits. Also, for example, there were external services such as the Church of San Brigida in Fitzroy that was providing students with some food and some financial support in some cases. And also as Meta Australia, we have actually provided with reduction of tuition fees, compromising our commission to the students in order to help them.
But all that is what we would call voluntary assistance. The reality is that, well, as I understand it, they couldn't leave the country because we wouldn't allow people to leave, and so they were forced to stay in Australia, and they either had to support themselves or rely on voluntary assistance from other agencies. And you didn't tell us the amount that the government offered them. How much would the eligible students have received under that scheme?
Absolutely. So the rent reduction was up to $2,000 and was a one-off, let's say, help that the Study Melbourne was providing. And the Victorian government, I think the support was about $1,100, and again was only a one-off payment,
which would be hardly sufficient to maintain a person for the period of time that we've been in lockdown, I would have thought.
Definitely. The question was a bit, was a bit complex because obviously the government approved their visa, and in theory, what should have happened at the time of visa granted was that the government made sure that the student had this financial capacity to support themselves during the period of study. So, for example, by my experience, none of our students returned back home, but there were students that actually left Australia. So some flight back were organized by the embassy. Some flights were organized actually individually by the students through flight companies. So they returned back because they couldn't afford to stay.
All right. And in terms of the future, do you think that the experience over the last 6 months will have a detrimental effect on the number of international students that will want to come to Australia to study?
Very good question. So, for example, we have decided not, even though we have decided not to apply for any further studies until the borders will reopen, because obviously there is a lot involved. So there is a visa to do, prove that the students from overseas, they will have to provide to us financial capacity, and also they will have to pay for the tuition in order to get a document called COE, confirmation of enrollment, in order to apply for their visa. So as an agent, as an agency, we have decided not to do this type of visas until the students could have a clearer picture of what would happen in the future once the border will be reopened and they will be allowed to come back in. Although the request of students from offshore that we are experiencing is huge, because probably let's say the situation would probably be a lot better off in Australia than offshore at the moment. I also talk about Italy, looking at the cases we got and the fact that people cannot go to actually school, they need to study online. So if Australia will reopen the borders to international and the class could be face-to-face, obviously, in my opinion, the level of education could benefit a lot.
And that would in turn assist the economy in Australia as well, because the loss in terms of fees must be astronomical, I would have thought.
That's right. And one more thing I would like to add on that is that almost all the education providers we deal with, they cannot offer very, let's say, entry-level English courses anymore because there are no more people that are coming from offshore. So if a student requires some help, let's say they cannot progress on to the next level, it's very difficult to provide a class only for 1 or 2 students because obviously the provider won't have a profit on that. So paying the teacher, paying, obviously the facility and dedicate a teacher only for 1 or 2 people is very complicated. So this is actually a problem that it's happening currently. There are.
Yeah. On that, do you know of any educational institution that has actually, to put it bluntly, closed its doors because of the effects of the virus and the lack of customers?
Yeah, so there are some providers that had to close, obviously, because of the regulation from the Department of Health, and now they slowly going back to normal. So there are some providers that are offering the students, especially now that they can sort of go back to school, they're saying, would you prefer to participate to your class online, or would you like to come back, for a face-to-face session? And it's important to book for this intention because they will have to organize the room based on social distancing and all of that.
My question was more directed to whether some of these educational providers have become financially unstable because of the COVID.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
COVID.
Yeah. In my experience, none of our providers have actually manifested that problem, but I think there are a few providers that are definitely struggling. Yeah.
And all right. And the final matter, because I know that time is going, is there a possibility of a student continuing to study once he's completed the course for which he obtained a visa in the first place?
Yes, students can always apply for another student visa if their intention is to continue studying. For example, they have been studying in Australia, they have actually really liked the educational system here and they familiarized with that. So they, if their intention has changed and they don't want to go back home and continue in studying, there is no law that actually doesn't allow them to reapply for another student visa, but obviously all of the requirements, they need to be met again. So genuinity and all of that.
And am I right that there are special subclasses of visa that in a way are designed to pick up some? So for example, subclass 186, which is meant to enable employers to nominate an employee, presumably the young man or woman who comes here to study cooking and qualifies as a chef, if they find an employer that's prepared to employ them, would they then qualify for the subclass 186 visa and be able to stay in Australia?
This is a good question to ask to a migration agent.
Okay. Right. I mean, I didn't want to.
The answer is they could, but the issue there will be English and work experience. So if they don't have 3 years work experience as a chef, right, and they can evidence that, they don't reach 6 for the scale of English for reading, writing, speaking, listening, they can't. But there are other visas like the 482 they can apply for.
All right.
That
And
was our migration expert here.
thank you. Thanks, Ciro. And I apologise for asking that question.
No, no problem, not a problem. It's a very fine line. It's a very fine line.
Thanks very much. I assume that there's a large pool of Italian students that are here to study.
5,000 in Australia.
Yes, so Joseph Zaya, our migration agent, was actually doing a little research while we were talking.
Don't ask Sam.
And yeah, so about 5,000 Italian students.
5,000, which is a significant number.
Yeah,
But not compared to the Chinese and Indians.
that's right. Colombians is about 19,000 roundabout. So it's already almost not 4 times the figure of Italians, and Chinese and Indians apparently it's a lot
Right.
more. So 100, well over the 100,000.
All right. All right. Well, look, thanks very much, Ciro. I hope that people will have been enlightened to some extent as to how the study visa system operates in Australia. And we're very grateful that you've given up your time to talk to us about it. Thanks very much.
It was my absolute pleasure, Vincent and Sam. So thank you so much for having me here, and I could explain all these requirements to prospective students who would like to come to Australia as well.
Thank you.